All right. I'm going to welcome you all to another evening lecture with Fraunces Tavern Museum. Remember, if you're joining us virtually and you have any questions during the lecture, please leave them in the Q&A box. We will be monitoring the Q&A during the lecture, so don't worry about saving your question to the very end. If you're joining us in person, you will be able to ask your questions at the end of the lecture. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Please note that the views of the speakers are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York or its Fraunces Tavern Museum. Let me introduce tonight's speaker. Jeffrey Rosen is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, where he hosts We the People, a weekly podcast of constitutional debate. He is also a professor of law at the George Washington University Law School and a contributing editor of The Atlantic. He was previously the legal affairs editor of The New Republic and a staff writer for The New Yorker. Rosen is a graduate of Harvard College, Oxford University, where he was a Marshall Scholar, and Yale Law School. He will be speaking today on his new book, The Pursuit of Happiness: How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America. I'm now going to turn it over to Jeffrey Rosen.
Hello, friends. Thank you so much for coming tonight. It is so exciting to be here at Fraunces Tavern, and I've been learning about the amazing history of this place. So let's inspire ourselves by thinking of George Washington addressing his soldiers, and think about the self-mastery that he exemplified in peacefully turning over power. It was that self-mastery, with Cincinnatus always as his model, that made him the most revered man of his age. I want to talk to you tonight about the moral philosophy that inspired Washington and Adams and Hamilton and Jefferson and all of the founders when they wrote those famous words in the Declaration of Independence about the pursuit of happiness. And I'll tell you about how I came to the unusual project of reading the books that inspired the founders and how it changed my understanding of happiness and how to be a good person and how to be a good citizen. So here's how this whole project happened. It was during COVID, and I was rereading the part of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography where he talks about his effort in his 20s to achieve moral perfection. And some of you may have seen his famous 13 Virtues project, where he made a list of 12 virtues it originally was. He added the 13th at the suggestion of a Quaker friend who said that he really needed to work on humility. So he added humility to his list. He started off with industry and temperance and cleanliness and order and chastity. And he made a list of these virtues, and he made a list of all the days of the week. And every week he chose to work on one virtue and to put an X mark next to the one where he fell short. He tried this for a while. He found it very depressing because there were so many X marks. He eventually gave up, but he thought he was better for having tried. It was morally improving. And he chose as his motto, and this is what I noticed during COVID, a passage from a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of before called the Tusculan Disputations. And it said, without virtue, happiness cannot be. So a few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville, Virginia, on the UVA campus. And there on the wall of the room, I saw that Thomas Jefferson had made a list of 12 virtues for his daughters. And they were almost identical to Franklin's. They were resolution, do what you ought and perform what you resolve. Silence, when angry, count to 10, when very angry, 100. Jefferson left one virtue off of his list, and that was chastity. And what really struck me was that Jefferson, when he was old, and people would write to him, what is the secret of happiness, would send a passage from this same book by Cicero that Franklin had cited, the Tusculan Disputations. And Jefferson's passage was longer, and it said, he who has achieved tranquility of soul, who is neither exalted by undue exuberance or weighted down by despondence, he is the wise, tranquil man of whom we request. He is the happy man. So basically, I thought, okay, I've got to read the Cicero book because it was so important to both Franklin and Jefferson in summing up their core understanding of happiness as virtue. But what else to read? And I found this amazing reading list that Jefferson would send out to anyone who asked when he was older about how to be an educated person. The kids who were going to law school or friends of his, he'd say, here's a list of books. And he not only prescribed the books to read, but also the way that you should read them. And it was a very arduous 12-hour-a-day reading schedule. You had to get up every morning before sunrise, read moral philosophy before sunrise, then political philosophy and history in the morning, and then astronomy and science in the afternoon, then dinner, then you were allowed some Shakespeare and poetry, then to bed, the next morning, at it again, 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. Then I saw this passage, one section of the list, and there's all sorts of great areas like literature and political philosophy and history. There's a section that sometimes he called natural religion and sometimes ethics. And at the top of that list was Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. And then classic Greek and Roman moral philosophers, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and then Enlightenment philosophers, Locke, Hutcheson, Bolingbroke, David Hume. I saw the list and I thought, I've got to read these books because I have had, as you heard, this wonderful liberal arts education. I just studied with great teachers at great universities, including Hugh Lamar, who we were talking about, and I'm still friends with today. But I've never read these books of moral philosophy. It was just to fill a gap in my education that I thought I would read them. So it was COVID. We all had a little more time, so I decided to follow Jefferson. I got up every morning before sunrise, not a normal thing for me. Read for an hour or two, watch the sunrise, and then I found myself writing sonnets to sum up the wisdom that I just read, which I understand is a practice that is extremely weird. It was not anything I've done before. But then I found out that all these people in the founding era did the same thing. They would read the moral philosophy and write sonnets, including Hamilton, Mercy Otis Warren, the great Phyllis Wheatley, the first published Black poet, and John Quincy Adams, who would, in the White House, read Cicero in the original, in particular the Tusculan Disputations, which is his favorite book, write sonnets, these really good ones, walk along the Potomac and watch the sunrise. So that's what I did, and I spent a year reading the books and writing the sonnets, and the reading just changed my life, because what I discovered was, first of all, that almost all of these books contain the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. So Jefferson wasn't pulling this out of thin air. It was everywhere. It was in the classical sources, it was in the Enlightenment sources, in the Christian sources, in the Whig and civic Republican sources. And for all of these moral philosophers, happiness meant not feeling good, but being good. Not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but of long-term virtue. And by virtue, they meant something particular. It's not intuitive from the word today. They meant self-mastery, self-improvement, character improvement, being your best self, we would say today, being a lifelong learner. And in particular, using your powers of reason to moderate or temper your unreasonable passions and emotions. This distinction between reason and passion is pervasive in the literature. It came from Pythagoras, I was amazed to learn. Not only did Pythagoras invent the triangle and the harmonic system of triads and fifths, but also he was a sage who lived on the island of Croton. He was surrounded by disciples who he encouraged first to be good and then to live like gods. And the way to live like gods was to achieve self-perfection through rigorous moderation in eating and drink. He was a very strenuous vegetarian, and he insisted on the importance of tranquility of soul. And he divided the soul into three parts: reason in the head, passion in the heart, and desire in the stomach. And he said we should use our powers of reason to moderate or modulate our unreasonable passions and desires, so we achieve the classical virtues: prudence, temperance, courage, and justice. Plato takes the Pythagorean distinction and puts it into his famous metaphor, the charioteer, reason, who's moderating or modulating the appetitive and noble horses, so they're all pulling in the same direction. And that's what you just see in Aristotle as well, in his notion of the golden mean. Aristotle famously defines virtue as an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. And the terms aren't self-defining, but we now understand with the reason-passion distinction that virtue really means kind of excellence of character. And that is exactly what happiness meant, not only in the ancient era, but also in the Enlightenment. It's always expressed in different ways. There are different technical and religious and theological debates, but the gist of it is impulse control. Remember the marshmallow test at Stanford? Those kids in the 70s are either given a choice between one marshmallow if they have it immediately, or two if they could wait for 15 minutes. And the kids who could wait did much better later in life. And that was the core teaching of the ancient philosophy, the need to moderate our immediate impulses so we could achieve long-term well-being. So that was what I came to know from the moral philosophy. And then I set out to see how the founders applied it in their own lives. And that's what the book is about. And what just struck me is how they talked about it constantly. You know, you could say, we might call it a kind of neurosis. I thought that having a Jewish mom was tough. Imagine having a Puritan mom like John Adams, who's constantly exhorting him to be perfect and to use his reason to moderate his passions. And as a result, he's constantly writing in his diary, you know, I'm spending too much time ice skating or drinking or at the theater. I didn't moderate my passions today, and beating himself up. His son, John Quincy Adams, is an even more incredible distillation of both the burden and reward of trying to achieve this kind of perfection. And if I had a favorite founder in the book, it would be Quincy Adams, because he's so mindful about his efforts to achieve perfection. There's this amazing passage in his 20s. He's just turned down a Supreme Court appointment. He is minister to St. Petersburg, and he writes in his diary, 27 years old, I haven't achieved anything. You know, I'm spending too much time probably at Fraunces Tavern or places like that, drinking too much, I'm growing corpulent, I've got to use my powers of reason to moderate my passions, and he resolves to do better. Then he has this incredible trial. He is president of the United States. He loses the election of 1828, and his oldest son commits suicide. George Washington Adams can't deal with the burden of that incredible name, and he also becomes an alcoholic. And his dad is always exhorting him to be perfect and writing these letters from a Christian father about moderating your passions. And Washington Adams kills himself, and Adams, John Quincy, feels like he's completely can't go on. This world is fallen in on him. What does he do? He spends a year rereading Cicero in the original, in particular the Tusculan Disputations. He writes his sonnets, and he emerges resolved to become the greatest abolitionist of his age. And then he denounces slavery after returning to the House of Representatives, proposes a constitutional amendment to ban slavery, is acclaimed by Frederick Douglass as the greatest white abolitionist of his age. And then, after casting a vote against the war in Mexico, collapses on the floor of the House of a stroke, and his last words, which he murmurs, are, I am composed, which he gets from Cicero, the idea of a perfectly composed manner, achieving the tranquility of soul that's necessary for virtue and happiness. It's just stunningly inspiring. What about the founders themselves? Let me tell you about a little bit about the highlights from several of them that I learned about. First, John and Abigail Adams. What do they do when they're dating? They decide to make a list of each other's faults. Not a great strategy, I can assure you. And they get this from Pythagoras and his golden virtues, because he recommends every night before bed making a self-accounting and making a list of your faults. That's where Franklin got his system. So Abigail is generous, and she says to John, well, your fault is, you know, some people find you intimidating, but it's only because you're so brilliant. You know, you are intimidating. And Adam says, well, your faults are you should practice the piano more, and you've got to read more, and you're pigeon-toed. She said, try to practice a little more, but a gentleman should never comment on a lady's posture. She's kind of good humored about it. Adams, of course, is the most famously vain and self-regarding man of the founding generation. Franklin says about him, a good man, always honest, but surely a little mad. And he's always raging at people for not giving him enough credit for the revolution. He says he was the one who really wrote the Declaration of Independence, but people don't give Adams the credit. He speaks about himself in the third person. And then he has this really dramatic friendship falling out and reconciliation with Mercy Otis Warren, who's such an inspiring character. The great poet of the Revolution. Adams calls her the poetical genius of the Revolution. He commissions her to write poems denouncing the British. A satire called The Adulator is acclaimed as among the most famous of its time. She gets it from her classical reading. She learns the classics alongside her brother, James Otis, the guy who denounces the writs of assistance and gives the famous speech that Adams said sparked the American Revolution. Otis gets to go to Harvard, as the guys do, but Mercy has to learn the classics in his schoolroom. But she's so learned and so brilliant that she writes these incredible classical poems. She's acclaimed by Adams. They're completely side by side. They have a falling out after the Revolution over politics. She writes a 2-volume history of America from an anti-federalist perspective. She has 5 pages saying that Adams is both vain and also a monarchist, because that's the Jeffersonian charge against the Federalists, that they're secretly pining for monarchy. Adams storms and says this isn't true. She said that you are vain, that you have praised the British Constitution. They don't talk for years. And Abigail brings them back together by sending Mercy a lock of her hair as a friendship gesture. They reconcile, and Adams then praises Otis Warren again. And she says, look, can I just ask one favor? I just went to the Boston Athenaeum, and some guy has taken credit for my play and put his name on the title page. You're the only one who knows I wrote it. Can you say so? And Adams says, absolutely. You're the only genius who could have written the play. Gets on his horse, rides to the Athenaeum, strides into the reading room, and writes on the title page of The Adulator, this was written by Mercy Otis Warren. You can still see that today in Boston. It's a sign of Adams' ultimate humility, and he's so relatable. He wears his heart on his sleeve, and he's endearing despite his vanity. And then there's his amazing reconciliation with Jefferson, bless you. And in those incredible letters, the Adams-Jefferson letters, read them if you haven't yet, because they're so learned and so deep. And what do they want to talk about when they're old, after they've been together for the Revolution, fought over politics, and then reconciled? We want to talk about the pursuit of happiness and virtue and comparative spirituality. And Adams is so excited when he learns that Pythagoras may have traveled to the east and read the Hindu Vedas, and he's convinced that this will show the deep connections between Eastern and Western moral philosophy, because the core of the Bhagavad Gita, as summed up by Gandhi, is renounce and enjoy. Renounce attachment to external events and enjoy eternal bliss. And the Gita also recommends that we are what we think. Life is shaped by the mind. And Pythagoras channeled this in his emphasis on self-mastery and on controlling the only thing we can control, which is our own thoughts and emotions, the Stoic dichotomy of control. So Adams sees these connections because he's so learned, but he's not sure if the translation of the Bhagavad Gita, which has just been completed, was read by Joseph Priestley. Did Priestley live long enough to read the translation? Jefferson said, good news, he lived. I've got the Priestley book about comparing the philosophy of the Hindus with that of the Greeks. I'll send it to you. And Adams is so excited. Just think of how hard it was for them to have access to books and how eager they were to read them. And you think of how easy it is for us to have access to books, and it's just a sign of the marvel of the age that we live in. And then Adams and Jefferson discuss their mature understanding of happiness. And Adams sums up all of his mature spirituality in what he calls the hymn of Cleanthes: love God and all his creatures, rejoice in all things. And Jefferson says that after a lifetime of reflection, he started off as more of a Stoic, but he's become an Epicurean, by which he means not pursuing pleasure, which is the Stoic caricature of Epicurus, but instead contraction of desire so that you can meet them. The Epicureans don't support hedonism, but they also don't think that we should avoid seeking pleasure at all. It just has to be rational pleasure. And by taking a realistic view of what will actually give us long-term well-being, Epicurus thought we can achieve that calm self-mastery, and that's Jefferson's mature understanding of the pursuit of happiness. I should say that one of the excitements of the book was tracing the specific documents that Jefferson had by his side when he wrote the Declaration. He said that he wasn't making anything original, but was just channeling the public books of the day, including Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Philip, and Algernon Sidney. And I would track down there are a few other documents. He had James Wilson's considerations on the extent of legislative authority in Britain. It's a fragment that looks a whole lot like the first paragraph of the Declaration. It talks about the point of government being, people being created equal, endowed by natural rights, and government needing to secure these rights. The Wilson draft has footnotes. I actually saw the original in the Pennsylvania Historical Society and despaired because I didn't know if I'd ever be able to have access to it again. And then miraculously, of course, it's online. So I was able just to follow the footnotes. And Wilson is quoting Burlamaqui, the Swiss natural law philosopher, Locke, not the two treatises, but the essay concerning human understanding, which is the one that contains the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, and defines the pursuit of happiness as basically impulse control, as the subjugation of reason, of passion by reason. And Samuel Johnson, in his 1755 dictionary, defines happiness as virtue, and cite as a footnote to Locke the passage that contains the phrase the pursuit of happiness. It's just all there hiding in plain sight. So what I'm sharing with you is Wilson has his footnotes to go back to Locke, and then George Mason in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, who talks about the pursuit of happiness, also reads Locke and so forth. It's amazing to me that the common story about why Jefferson said the pursuit, people ask, why did he use the pursuit of happiness rather than life, liberty, and property, which is what John Locke talks about in the second treatise. And the standard line in nearly all the histories is that happiness is a substitute for property. But that's not right. Locke in the second treatise is talking about natural rights, rights that we have in the state of nature. But the Declaration is talking about unalienable rights, and the essay concerning human understanding makes clear happiness is an unalienable right where property is alienable. What does that mean? When we go from the state of nature to civil society, we alienate or surrender certain rights in order to get greater security and safety of the rights we've retained. Obviously, property is alienable. You have to alienate it to trade it, and also government has to be able to enforce contracts and so forth. So you have to alienate total control over property. But you can't alienate control over the pursuit of happiness because the core of happiness is reason. And reason is inherent in who we are as human beings. That's why Jefferson, in surely his greatest work of all, is the Virginia Declaration on Religious Freedom, explains that the rights of conscience are unalienable because they're based on our reason. Jefferson says the opinions of men, being dependent on evidence contemplated by their own minds, cannot be controlled by other men. In other words, I can't alienate to you the power to control my thoughts or to tell me what to think. I can't entirely control them myself because they're the product of my reason. I can moderate or modulate them, but my reason is inherent in who I am. So that is why happiness and conscience are unalienable. Property is alienable, and that's why not just Jefferson, but Wilson, Mason, and everybody talked about happiness as an unalienable right. Now, what about Jefferson and slavery? It's obviously a crucially important question. How can this founder, who spends all this time insisting that without virtue, happiness cannot be, and that without liberty, we are slaves, so notoriously violate his own principles? How could he justify such a thing? What I discovered is that he didn't even try. In fact, all of the enslavers from Virginia of this generation recognized that slavery violated both the Bible and natural rights recognized in the Declaration. There's one really striking speech from Patrick Henry that I found. He's just given the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech from Cato's letters. And he says, "Is it not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I will not justify it. I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it." That's what it was. They liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up. And they knew it was hypocritical. They knew that it was immoral. They just couldn't be bothered to live their principles. And Jefferson, on close examination, becomes even more shocking in his hypocrisy. First, because he was so incredibly avaricious. He was addicted to this luxurious lifestyle in Monticello, which he constructed as a kind of Palladian fantasy of a Roman idyll. But he's constantly buying expensive furniture in France because he can't meet his debts. And his whole political philosophy is based on the impossibility of one generation passing on a debt to another. That he's constantly worried about passing on his debts to his daughters, which is his justification for not freeing his enslaved population, including his own kids. And the people who are right in his house serving him are his children by Sally Hemings. He promises her, when she agrees to come back from Paris, where he begins their, sleeping with her when she's 16 and he's in his 40s. She'll come back and he'll free her kids when he dies. He keeps the promise and frees 2 of their kids. The other 2 have already escaped. He let them escape earlier, but he frees no one else, and parents are separated from children, and the entire population has to be broken up, supposedly so he wouldn't have to pass on his debts, which he does anyway. The other thing that's really shocking about Jefferson is what a racist he was, and the notes on the state of Virginia are shocking in his insisting on the intellectual inferiority of Black people. And the most shocking passage is where he says, "Phyllis Wheatley's poetry is beneath contempt. Unlike white slaves in Rome, Black people can't be good poets, and therefore her poetry is no good." What's so amazing about this is that the other founders were not similarly racist. And I have a chapter on Phyllis Wheatley. It's just what an amazing story. She comes over enslaved from Africa. She's educated in the classics by her master and mistress, who let her sit in on their kids' classes in the schoolroom. She reads Cicero and Seneca and all the people that everyone else reads. And she starts writing these amazing classically infused poems of virtue, talking about the need for self-mastery in the revolution and also the immorality of slavery. And she sends these poems to George Washington. Unlike Jefferson, the great Washington acclaims her genius. He calls her a genius and says that he'd be honored to receive her at Mount Vernon. And then there is a dispute. The poems are so good, could she have written them? So the city of Boston holds a trial, and it's presided over by John Hancock, the guy who wrote the Declaration, and Cotton Mather, and all these Puritan divines. And they gravely examine her. They conclude that she did indeed write her own poems. They certify that she wrote her poems, and then she becomes an international celebrity. Professor Henry Louis Gates calls her the Oprah of her day. She goes to London, she meets the Duke, she's given the keys to the city, and she's just a total hit. And is acclaimed in her time in America by all except for Jefferson. And that's just another point to Jefferson's eternal shame. Let's talk about Washington, because we're here in Fraunces Tavern. I started off by imagining him in his farewell to the troops. In the book, I talk about another very famous moment of his self-mastery, and that's at Newburgh, where the soldiers are rebelling and they want to be paid. There's inflation, and Congress won't give them their back pay, and they're threatening to have a mutiny in the middle of the war. And Washington, who read Seneca and Aurelius and the classics as a kid, mounts this stage called the Temple of Virtue. He reads from his favorite play, Addison's Cato, And then he famously, in preparing to read a speech, takes out his reading glasses, says, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I've grown old in your service, and now I've grown almost blind." The soldiers weep. They've never seen him confess weakness before. And then he calls for self-mastery and prudence and temperance and the classical virtues. He says, "Maintain your self-control, and I will ensure that you get paid." The mute is averted. He does eventually ensure that they're paid. And his men say, "Never have they seen him greater," because of his self-control. And that was really what made him so great. He acknowledged himself that he wasn't the most brilliant, he wasn't a great intellectual, but his character is so high that all trust him. And at the Constitutional Convention, he doesn't say much, but just the simple self-mastered power of his towering presence is enough to persuade both sides to come together and to ratify the Constitution. The fact that everyone knows that he'll be president is the most important thing in allowing him to empower a relatively strong executive. And he has a very keen sense of the theatrical and the presentation, and it's deeply rooted in his youthful classical learning. Ron Chernow speculates he was also, his mom was always hectoring him, and he's constantly really upbraiding her for basically saying, "Stop nagging me." And Chernow thinks maybe that put him on the hair trigger, and he had a hot temper that he struggled to control. Very few moments when anyone saw him lose his temper. When he goes to Congress and to read a speech and they disrespect him, he storms out and says, "This defeats the purpose of my coming here." But it's very rare. He's just so tremendously composed, and that is the source of his greatness. And that idea of the perfectly virtuous leader who, through his own self-mastery, is able to serve the public interest rather than to pander to factions, is the core of his farewell address, which Hamilton writes for him, where he says that the republic will fall unless citizens can find the self-mastery and self-discipline to achieve the personal self-government that's necessary for political self-government. And if we don't, Washington warns, we'll descend to demagogues and the mob. Remember, the whole Constitution is set up to avoid mobs and demagogues. Shays' Rebellion, the farmers mobbing the courthouse in Western Massachusetts. The Constitution is designed to slow down deliberation so that mobs can't organize. And by the time they do, they'll be tired and go home. This helped me understand the Federalist Papers and the whole theory of the Constitution in a new light. Because the Federalist Papers, as they say repeatedly, are a manual for public happiness. They use the phrase public happiness. And Madison is very explicit about the connection between private happiness and public happiness. He says that, having studied classical psychology at Princeton, we have to achieve the same balance in the constitutions of our mind that we achieve in the state. And just as individuals use their powers of reason to master their unreasonable passions, so citizens in a republic have to achieve the same self-mastery. That's why Madison is always using that reason-passion distinction. He famously says in Federalist 55, in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. There's that reason, passion, and mob distinction. And then the whole definition of factions in Federalist 10 is any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. That's Madison's distinctive contribution to political theory. He does get it from Hume, who famously thought that Montesquieu was wrong. You could only have republics in small territories where people knew each other well enough to deliberate face to face. Hume says, actually, if you have a system of representation, then size could be a benefit because it'll be hard for factions to organize. And Madison takes that and runs with it in Federalist 10. So you see why the pursuit of happiness is both a private and a public responsibility. Unless citizens achieve that self-mastery, they won't do two things. First, learn enough about liberty to defend it when it's under threat, and also vote for wise, temperate, moderate, and self-mastered leaders who will be devoted to the public good rather than to the self-interest. Indeed, exactly. That's the whole point of the system, and they're not sure it's going to work. At the end of their lives, all of them are in different ways are worried that, never before in human history have democracies succeeded on a large scale. That's why America is not a pure democracy, because they're afraid it'll succumb to demagogues and mobs. But in this mixed republic, they hope it'll work, but it's going to depend on citizens achieving enough virtue to vote wisely and also to educate themselves enough to defend liberty. And Hamilton and Jefferson are so afraid of Caesar on horseback, the demagogue who will come and subvert the republic. And Hamilton has this amazing line saying the only thing that can subvert the republic is, a demagogue who comes in of poor morals and, devoted to his own ambition, will reap the whirlwind. And that's why Hamilton wants a president for life. Because he thinks that, like the British king, a president for life, elected for life, not hereditary, won't be tempted to, succumb to personal ambition, but will be able to achieve the public good. Jefferson's also afraid of demagogues, and I found this amazing letter where he writes to Madison. He's just gotten a copy of the Constitution. He said, "I'm afraid of two things. First, there's no Bill of Rights, and second, it's terrible that the president's eligible for re-election, because in the future, our president might lose re-election by a few votes, cry foul, enlist the states who voted for him, and refuse to leave office." This is Jefferson's fear in his letter about the Constitution. And Jefferson's solution is a one-year term limit. Hamilton wants a life term. Both of them are afraid of these demagogues who will put their personal ambition above the public interest and subvert the Constitution and the rule of law. And they're not sure that the system will work, and it all depends on self-mastery. I do have, I take the story up to the present day. There's a chapter on Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. What an amazing story Frederick Douglass is, among so much else, because of his testimony to the radical power of reading. What's the moment where Douglass feels most enslaved? No, it's not when he's physically shackled. It's when his mistress starts to teach him how to read, and the wicked master says, "Don't teach him how to read, that'll make his mind free." And he feels the attempt to shackle his mind is devastating. He's infuriated that anyone would try to do that. So what does he do? He goes out in the streets of Baltimore. He buys reading lessons with bread. He pays boys to teach him how to read. And then he buys with bread a copy of this golden book, the Columbian Orator. And this book has excerpts from Cicero and Seneca and all the possible moral philosophy that inspired the founders, and also a dialogue on slavery about a slave arguing for his own freedom, persuades the master to free him. And Douglass says it's a bolt of lightning that changes his conception of himself as a free thinker, and this resolves him to become the greatest abolitionist of his age. When you think about what Douglass and Lincoln got the reading in the McGuffey reader, Murphy's English reader, had to do, they were self-taught, didn't get to go to fancy universities, just reading, in Douglass's case, literally with bread. When you realize the astonishing heights that they were able to achieve through their own devotion to reading, well, it certainly is an inspiring lesson to all of us. And it's true that in many ways our current world seems like Douglass and Lincoln and Madison's nightmare. And you think about the social media effects of this culture where posts based on passion travel further and faster than those based on reason. Enraged to engage is the business model, as opposed to the cool voice of reason overcoming passion. You think also of the fact that when Madison thought, what's going to make the whole system work? He has faith in this new media technology, the broadside press. And he thinks that when citizens read complicated arguments like the Federalist Papers and the new newspapers that are traveling into coffee houses, and they read them and they discuss them with their representatives, slowly reason will diffuse across the land. And this new class of enlightened journalists that he calls the literati, a phrase that he gets from Condorcet, will, kind of like a group of New Yorker editors, will slowly diffuse reason across the land and will allow public education on a universal scale, something that's never been seen before in human history. When you contrast that faith in reason and in media with the world of X or Instagram or whatever it is, it's alarming because so much hinges on the capacity of citizens to educate themselves. But if our world in some ways is the antithesis of the founders, it also does give grounds for hope. And it just blows my mind that I was able to write this entire book and do all of that COVID reading lying on my couch. Because all of the books in the world are online. It is incredible. And you can get, there's this Delphi edition publishes out of print complete works of everybody for $1.99, Cicero and Seneca and everyone. And here I'm carrying around on my phone all of the great books of the world. If I want, I can read the actual editions that the founders did with their own marginalia because it's been digitized by Google. When I was a kid, I went to the library. I grew up in New York, by the way. I'm so glad to be back here. And I went to DC with my mom for the first time. I went to the Library of Congress. And I think the Thomas Jefferson building is the most beautiful in all of DC. It's just so inspiring. And I was so filled with wonder with my mom, really young, at the thought that all the books in the world were in that one place. It was so moving. Well, now I'm just carrying them around on my iPhone. And all I need is the self-discipline to read them. So if there's a takeaway for this great project, here it is. I just learned the really powers of habit and the transformative power of deep reading. I went to wonderful schools and I was a reader for when I was a kid, but I've gotten out of the habit of reading outside of my job or my deadline, just reading to improve myself. And that's what I learned during COVID. And that habit of getting up and watching the sunrise and spending the morning hours doing deep reading, I've tried to maintain. I have maintained. So here's my rule. I try to get up before the sunrise and often do. But the most important thing is I have to read for an hour or so every morning. I'm not allowed to browse. I just can't look at email or newspapers. I can't do anything except for read a book. And reading books rather than browsing is really a totally transformative life habit. I was able to write that book. I'm now writing another one on Hamilton and Jefferson. I'm learning so much every day. It's so exciting. All I need to do is swipe left to Kindle and not right to newspapers, and I just can learn a whole lot. And Jefferson has this great line, I've given up newspapers for Tacitus, and I feel much better. And, newspapers and blogs, it's not the same as books. You'd think it is, and I always had all these excuses, well, it's for my job, I've got to know what's going on. But it's totally different. Deep reading, actually reading books, is transformative. It's the key to the pursuit of happiness. I do want to share my most precious possession, my grandfather in Detroit, Michigan, who I never met him, he died during the Depression, but in 1933, he went to the newly constructed Detroit Public Library and copied out in his own hands this wooden legend which says the fountain of wisdom flows through books. Beautiful Greek legend I have at my house, and it's just true, and the founders recognized the transformative power of deep reading, and they fell short of their ideals on so many levels, on slavery, on industry, they were human in so many ways, but they kept the habits of deep reading that they had as kids until the end. And when you think about Adams and Jefferson and Frederick Douglass and Lincoln, throughout their long lives, just reading and learning and growing, it's an inspiration to us all. Thank you so much. We'll look at your questions.
Let me quick bring you the microphone, and we'll alternate back and forth from questions here in the room and questions from Zoom online.
Thank you. I have a comment and then a question. The comment is, you mentioned a lot of names of those who sought to emulate those who preceded them, maybe by hundreds of years, in order to improve themselves, self-perfect themselves. But it made me think of so many great thoughts and philosophies where there was not a name attached. And I'm thinking specifically, of course, there are other sources as well, but at the top of my head, I was thinking of the ethics of the fathers.
Yes,
My question, now, my question is not about that.
yes.
When you think about those who sought their self-perfection in however methods they try to do that, you were mentioning politicians, and I was wondering, might they be more conflicted considering who they were and the power that they wielded than ordinary people? Who might, I don't know. You know, they're human beings, it wouldn't be correct for me or anyone to say that they were less capable of perfecting themselves. But they were politicians, and I don't say that in a negative way, because they had expressed thoughts and opinions which they know would go both ways. It would be pro and con. So that conflict might make it more difficult for them to achieve what they're attempting to do, to better themselves.
Two great questions. The reference to the wisdom of the fathers, Pirkei Avot, makes me very interested in the Jewish connections, and it's really striking that Franklin was translated to Hebrew by a Hasidic rabbi who turned the Franklin system into a Jewish system called Musar, or character improvement, which I came across. So a rabbi in DC recommended it, and a friend and I tried it without knowing it came from Franklin. We just have the Hebrew version, and we also found it very depressing, but we enjoyed it. And there are, he was a Hasidic rabbi called Mendel Leffen and Luzzatto. I read these wonderful books of moral improvements, including Pirkei Avot, during some study with rabbis, and I think I totally agree with you. They don't have names attached, but it's really striking how the Jewish wisdom traditions, like the Gita and like the Dhammapada and like the Eastern traditions, many of which don't have names too, are all struggling with the same questions. And the moral core of the teachings, which is self-mastery, focus on what you can control, your own thoughts and emotions, don't attach to external results, is so much more important than the doctrinal differences. And I think that's why Adams was so struck by the connection between Pythagoras and the Gita. And for me, it was all very much of a piece. There's a really interesting point about politicians too. I mean, no question that politicians often betray their principles. And the Hamilton Jefferson book, which is tracing how all political parties in American history have invoked Hamilton and Jefferson. And it's incredible how opportunistic they are. They just keep switching back and forth between states' rights and national power in order to achieve particular results. So that's certainly perhaps a rebuke to their political consistency, but the quest to become more perfect, certainly not perfect, is it's human, whether you're a politician or an artist or anyone, a person. It's a struggle, it's a daily quest, and it's very difficult to achieve. So the wisdom is very universal and human, it transcends occupations and so forth, but you're absolutely right that politicians, especially like Jefferson, for example, because they embrace ideals, are more likely to betray. Great points.
I have a question from Robert on Zoom. He asks, if pursuit of happiness is associated with impulse control and reason, how does Jefferson explain his relationship with Sally Hemings, irrespective of her being a slave?
Such a great question, and he doesn't and he can't. I mean, it's just a complete self-justification and form of hypocrisy that he just denies. He has this remarkable capacity for compartmentalization and, convinces himself that he's the head of a happy family. He actually calls his enslaved population his family. In his kid's case, they actually are his family, and he says he's laboring for their happiness, and he's always insisting that he favors emancipation at some point in the distant future. He doesn't even free Sally Hemings on her death, although his daughters do. That wasn't part of the original bargain. I mean, it certainly was not uncommon for enslavers of his generation to have kids with their slaves, with their enslaved women. and to deny it. So he wasn't breaking the mold, but for the great prophet of liberty and equality, the great libertarian, to so completely and shamefully deny this relationship is just a permanent taint on his legacy.
The picture that your remarks present is one where basically all of the founders buy into this concept of pursuing virtue. They might quibble. Benjamin Franklin may have chastity on his list, Jefferson doesn't. But were there people we would regard as founders, legitimately regard as founders, who just didn't buy into this virtue, perfection, self-perfection business and had a more kind of rough and ready, pragmatic view towards life?
Well, I'm sure that they did, and I don't know, I'm reading now about Andrew Jackson and sort of that generation, just self-educated frontiersman, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, actually a serious constitutional thinker and not a demagogue in the end, because he supported union over nullification, but I don't think he did a lot of reading of Cicero. But it was not just a class thing, because Lincoln and Douglas did get it. I'm distilling the common wisdom of these thinkers, and people applied it in different ways. Some are much more conventionally Christian than others, and Washington is actually quite conventional in his Christianity. John Quincy Adams is a very devout Christian who reads the Bible in the original and comes up with a really creative original argument that Jesus prophesies the end of slavery, because he says, "I'll free the captives," and promises liberty to all people. And Quincy Adams uses that to inspire his abolitionism. So that's, and then there are just kind of louche characters like Aaron Burr, who is kind of European in his cynical disdain for conventional morality, and is famous for having lots of affairs and writes about them to his daughter, who he really likes, and he's just very continental in his morals and so forth. So it varies. I'm by no means presuming to suggest that there's a single moral framework for everyone. It's just that this is so in the air. And I want to stress again, it's coming from all the traditions. Some people are getting it from Christian preachers like Wollaston and Tillotson, others from the classical Greeks and Romans, others from the revolutionary literature. If you were a kid, from not only the 18th century, but the 19th, even into the 20th, you were kind of hit over the head with a version of this, and how you apply it, I guess, is up to you.
I have one more question from Zoom. Robert asks, since Washington did not have a formal education, it seems to me that he did not read the classics or writings that were read by other founders. How did his belief in civilian authority versus military authority come about? Did he ever read about Cincinnatus?
Great. So you're absolutely right. He didn't read them in the original, but he definitely read the popular versions of them. He read Seneca's letters in translation, which are so great. The Seneca's on time. He gets his obsession with clocks from Seneca. Seneca says in the letter to Lucilius on time, "Time is a gift repaid by industry, by squandering it. What fools these mortals be." That line from Midsummer Night's Dream is from Seneca, and Washington takes it to heart. And he loves The Spectator and Addison, both Addison's Cato and Addison's Spectator. I'm recommending these just because they're really the stuff Washington read is the most accessible versions of this. Addison and Pope write in The Spectator this kind of popularized Stoicism. Pope's essay on man, the most popular of its time. Abigail Adams loves it. Totally fun to read out loud because it's so accessible and musical. And he loves Cato so much, the play, that he has it read to the troops at every opportunity. It's staged because he thinks that it'll promote morality and so forth. And he certainly got Cincinnatus from, if it's not in Cato, he got it from the classics, and he's very self-consciously styling himself on Cincinnatus. His whole self-image of pursuing honorable fame rather than low ambition and serving the public interest is all through this self-taught desire to live up to the classical ideals. So he, in some ways, oh, and then of course there's his famous rules on civility, which you can get in gift shops. Surprisingly, they're written by a French Jesuit, so it shows how the Christian tradition through Augustine and the Jesuits sums up the same rules. The rules of civility are very practical. It's things like lol, not the tongue at the dinner table, all sorts of good practical advice. And Washington reads that and just spends so much time trying to be a gentleman, by which he understands, a self-composed, self-mastered person who lives up to the classical ideal. So a great testament to the fact that you don't have to read the stuff in the original in order to be inspired by it. It was really practical self-help advice for everyone.
Questions in the room?
I don't mean to go off topic, but I'm curious about your thoughts about the indigenous Native American population and your philosophies behind what may have had an impact on founders and their thought process.
That's so interesting. I don't know about their philosophies. There are some who claim that the early Native American constitutions helped to inspire the US Constitution, which is an interesting suggestion. It's a great encouragement to learn about their philosophies, because they may one thing that does strike me about all of what I understand of the indigenous philosophies, both in America and throughout the world, is that they often are ultimately believe in a single creator, although they may have individual deities. Calling them polytheistic or pagan, which is what the Christians do, is really a gross caricature. The idea is that the universe will be united when we understand that God is one, and that there's the one divine spirit that one has to align with. So my sense is that there may be deep connections between those philosophies, as there were between those in the East, and I want to check it out. I will say I've been reading about Native American removal for this Hamilton Jefferson book, and it's just shocking. It's really, it's just the brutality and hypocrisy of it, both in, and it comes from Jefferson. It's another of part of his legacy. His greatest achievement as president is the Louisiana Purchase, which doubles the size of the US. He has to completely abandon his strict constructionist philosophy in order to justify it, because he thinks it's unconstitutional. But the whole point of it for him is it'll allow white men to settle the West, and Indians, Native Americans, can be removed from the East and sent west of the Mississippi to allow the East to develop free from their, being from the Native Americans. And Jackson picks that up and just brutally enforces it. He invokes federal power when it's convenient in order to forcibly remove the Native Americans, but refuses to intervene when Georgia is defying the Supreme Court and won't embrace treaty rights, and they're basically just determined to remove Native Americans at all costs, and that's the trail of tears that results. So it's an important part of the story. It's really a reminder that the Jeffersonian vision of democracy is for white men, white male agrarian settlers, and Native Americans and African Americans are not part of Jefferson.
More questions in the room?
Well, before I heard about your book, I guess I assumed that pursuit of happiness was like to, fulfill your talents or your occupations and that type of thing. So what was your first thought about it? And I also thought about, from how you're describing it, I would think, you would be too happy because you would need all those virtues. I would suspect that the biggest virtue you should have is forgiveness, and including forgiveness of yourself.
Two great points. You said fulfilling your occupations or your talents. I think that's a good phrase for summing up some versions of the classical wisdom. And Jefferson uses that in the first inaugural, where he says the pursuit of happiness is to the fruits of your talents and virtuous labor and stuff like that. So that idea of engaging in the ordinary occupations of life to fulfill your talents is key. That's what the Supreme Court embraces when it recognizes the pursuit of happiness as a constitutional right in the 19th century and 20th century cases involving the right to engage in ordinary occupations, to educate your kids in school and so forth. And therefore, that right to engage in occupations and talents free from discriminatory regulations has been recognized by the Supreme Court as a constitutional right. And the court invoked it in the gay marriage cases, where they said that the right to make intimate personal decisions is part of following these ordinary occupations. So I think that's a good way to put it. What about forgiveness? It's not a Puritan virtue, certainly. And it's not a, and that's why Quincy Adams is just constantly guilt-ridden for not living up to his potential. I don't know how stoic it is either. And it's more of a Christian virtue, faith, hope, and charity, as opposed to the classical virtues of prudence, temperance, courage, and justice. And the cost of this constant injunction to be perfect, which is always Christian as well as classical, Jesus says to the disciples, be perfect, even as, you know, as the Lord is perfect. It's really psychologically tough. I had this amazing moment in college, studying with a great Puritan scholar, Sack Van Berkovich, and I was sitting in class, and he says, "Isn't it?" No, I shouldn't say it's hard. I'll just say it. Wasn't Jesus right that we all should try to be perfect? And that was what the Puritans thought. It just kind of really jarred me, and maybe yes, but the cost is so high, and that's what Puritans experienced, and the idea of of forgiveness and charity toward oneself and others is important.
All right, I'm going to end us on this question from Zoom before I read our final announcements. Sarah asks, here is a chance to plug your wares. What is your next book about? When can we look for that in bookstores or online?
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to plug it. I'm so excited about this book. It is Hamilton and Jefferson, The Battle for the Soul of America, 1776 to 2026. And it's in some ways the most obvious of all topics, but I haven't seen someone bring it together like this. The argument is that the initial battle between Hamilton and Jefferson on national power versus states' rights, liberal construction versus strict construction, and democracy versus republicanism has defined all of American political and constitutional history. And the first half traces their battle, and then the second half just takes it all the way up to the present. It's so exciting. It'll be out at the beginning of 2026 in time for the 250th anniversary. I'd love to come back to discuss it. And since you nicely asked for a plug, let me end by plugging the amazing free online educational resources of the National Constitution Center, which I have the honor to lead. It is extraordinary to go to constitutioncenter.org. It's now among the most Googled constitutions in the world, 80 million hits since we launched, and it has the leading liberal and conservative thinkers in America writing about every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree about and what they disagree about. So you can click on the habeas corpus clause and see Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Katyal talking about what they agree and disagree, multiply that by 80, and it's just amazing. And then there are the podcasts, which I host every week, and these free online classes, which we're doing with Khan Academy on the Constitution, and primary sources from the Founders Library. It's just a constitutional heaven is what it is, and it's all free. So in the spirit of industry and self-improvement, go to the Interactive Constitution, click on a clause you don't know about and want to learn more about, and then just follow that wonderful rabbit hole of learning and light, which will hopefully inspire lots more reading and learning to come. Thank you for a wonderful.
Thank you so much for that presentation, and thank you all for joining us tonight. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture and would like to stay up to date with all of our programs, you can join our mailing list by going to FrauncestavernMuseum.org. There you can also find our calendar of upcoming programs, including our Flag Day Parade celebration and open house on Friday, June 14th from noon to 5 p.m. Our next lecture will be on Monday, June 24th as part of the exhibition opening preview for Lafayette, A Hero's Return, our new exhibition. Thank you to those of you who have donated to the museum. Your generous support helps us fulfill our mission and share the history of the American Revolutionary era with the public. If you would like to donate, you can also do that on our website, frauncestavernmuseum.org. Thank you again for joining us at another Fraunces Tavern Museum lecture, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
The next time I come,